Hello and welcome once again to the Irish Military Seminar. I'd like to acknowledge our hosts, Riverbank Arts Centre, June Fest, and of course the County Kildare Decade of Commemorations Committee of Kildare County Council. I have the honour of welcoming Michael Foley, Deputy Sports Editor and GAA Correspondent for the Irish edition of the Sunday Times, to look at his seminal work on the tragic events of Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November 1920, entitled The Bloodied Field. He has also been heavily involved in the GAA's busy programme of events for the Bloody Sunday commemorations. You're welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Mario. Great to be here.
So, Bloody Sunday 1920, can we just set the scene? What was Dublin? You made a point in the book that people are waking up to a benign Sunday morning.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, so benign that even the weather is unseasonably benign. It's a sunny morning in November, in late November. It's a lovely day. People are going about their daily business, you know, they're going to mass, they're going out to get the newspaper, they're strolling around even at 9 o'clock in the morning, kind of that early. The sun is shining in the sky, the canal is glittering. Everything is set for a nice, restful Sunday that you'd normally look forward to.
And all that was to change very quickly.
Very, very quickly. The first thing that happens is you have the attacks by the IRA squads, organised by Michael Collins, on alleged spies and agents across the city. 14 victims in the end. And we're talking about, sometimes, and it's the case with a lot about the Bloody Sunday story, kind of we've grown up with the idea of, yes, there was spies and agents killed that morning, full stop. But when you look into the detail of what happened in those bedrooms and how that killing was done, it straight away brings you into the heart of what unfolds and the mood around the day and the horror of the day. I mean,
yeah, and the difficulties, the trauma that some of the victims and the perpetrators deal with, of course, for many, many years to come. But 100 years on, like, I mean, if 2020, that would have resonated, would have been instant news across the city. Yeah. And I mean, everybody would have known what was happening. But in 1920, I mean, does it take time for this to get out? You know, how long before people realise what's happened?
You're probably talking a couple of hours. I mean, we know that, it was, say, Frank Burke, for example, the Dublin footballer originally from Kildare, who was going to play in the football game between Tipperary and Dublin that afternoon in Croke Park. He was getting the tram across from the Rathfarnham area. So he's on the tram probably around 11, 12 o'clock in the day, and already the chat is on the tram about what happened in the morning, how many people were killed, what's going to happen next. Because at that stage in the War of Independence, people have become accustomed to, well, if one side does one thing, the other side are definitely going to react. So it wasn't a question of whether something was going to happen, it was only a matter of where and when. If you went down to Dublin Castle, sort of the symbol of British rule in Ireland for so long, it was a scene of absolute chaos. Anybody with any connection to the British administration and their families were arriving at Dublin Castle, having heard of this news of these agents being shot in their beds.
So such was the terror and fear that these people were feeling.
Just get me inside the castle grounds. Give me somewhere to stay. When the castle was full of people, they closed the big steel gates and they found hotels in the area to put people in to keep them safe, or at least make them feel safe. So that's the level. So you're asking, like, how quickly did people know? Relatively quickly. The sandwich boards for the new kind of advertising what news, because the newspapers were rolling that time. You'd have different editions during the day. Had news of kind of how many people were killed, and obviously the numbers varied wildly. The original notion was that the IRA had done the entire British intelligence service in, and they were going to bring the war somewhere else next. So that was the sense. That was the sense around the city.
And this is the fear, isn't it? Because really, you called it the death dance between the IRA and the authorities. I mean, one tragic episode or one brutal episode and the reprisal that would follow.
Yeah.
You made a very good point when you discussing. I think Collins was nearly lifted in Vaughan's hotel the night before. He this remarkable, ability to kind of elude capture. But he makes his way back to Shanahan's. He actually meets up with a couple of Tipperaries and warns them.
That's right.
That there might be.
He was in Vaughan's, as you said. They were kind of just finalising the final details and then having a drink afterwards. But then they got word that Vaughan's was going to be raided, which is where Conor Clune, who gets killed the following night in Dublin Castle, that's where he's picked up. Because his name isn't on the register when they go and they find this random person, they don't know who he is. So Collins goes from Vaughan's to Shanahan's, which would have been a well-known sort of, it would have been a catch-all really, because you would have found IRA people there, but you also would have found, British soldiers. It was just a cross-section of everybody would have been there. But this particular night he landed in late, and it was run by a guy called Phil Shanahan, who was from Tip originally. A couple of Tipperary players, including Michael Hogan, were in the bar that night, but when Collins came in, he got chatting. He just said to people whoever was there at that stage of the night, he said, "Don't go to Croke Park tomorrow." He just had a feeling.
Don't go to Croke Park. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ominous, isn't it? Because obviously Collins is masterminding this attack. He's sending the squad out. He's sending these men out. But at the back of his mind, he knows that something will, or at least may, happen the next day.
Yeah.
And right from the start, there is a fear that Croke Park could become a target.
He's aware of the human cost, I think. I mean, these guys, and I think what often jolts me back to reality, if you like, with this whole story is the youth. I mean, Michael Collins wasn't an old man when he was doing this. Vinnie Byrne, who led one of the attacks the following morning, was 19 years of age. He went into a bedroom and shot 2 guys in cold blood. And a lot of these IRA men did this work. And you don't do something like that and not have it affect you in some way, shape or form going down the years. In Collins's case, as you say, absolutely aware that what we are going to do tomorrow, what is going to happen tomorrow morning, is going to have a huge effect.
But you also made the point that it's not a counterpunch. It's not just something that they're doing and risking other people's. They're struggling for survival themselves at this stage against the intelligence war. It really, isn't it?
Yeah.
From the authorities' side.
The reality for the IRA at that time is that they're on the ropes. I mean, activities in Dublin, even itself, had more or less ground to a halt. I mean, there wasn't an awful lot going on. Whatever was going on in terms of the IRA bringing the war to the British authorities was going on down the country. RIC barracks had been more or less cleared out of the countryside into urban areas. But the likes, we say, for example, bringing in the auxiliary force to Dublin had a positive effect from a British point of view in terms of bringing the war to the IRA. The intelligence service was making inroads to the point that they were really, really close.
The net was closing in, wasn't it, really?
All they needed was photographs of these guys. Yeah. All they needed was photographs of some of Collins's closest people and Collins himself to get them. So this was really, for the IRA, this was almost something they had to do. Yeah. It was something they had to do to revive the war for themselves and also to give themselves the space.
But the net was closing in. I mean, their intention was to wipe out the British intelligence agents that were actually hunting them down. So this is part of their war. They're not just making a statement. This is part of their struggle.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's the progress that the intelligence service is making compared, for example, to the Black and Tans, who were brought in as a kind of an addition to the RIC police force because they simply couldn't get volunteers. That didn't work. I mean, fundamentally at the bottom of all this, you have the issue that Britain itself is not taking the IRA as seriously as they possibly should. They're not declaring martial law. They're not looking at what we know as the War of Independence as a war. They're looking at it as criminal acts that can be dealt with by the police. So the bringing in of the auxiliaries and the intelligence services represents an upscale on their part, and there's an immediate result for them. So the IRA have to bounce back, and what are they going to do?
I think there was a fear maybe on their part as well that they wouldn't legitimise this struggle. They wouldn't call it a war, and they wouldn't deal with it in those terms.
Like, you kind of have to think as well, I mean, for us, 100 years later, the idea of an independent Ireland is not something we even think twice about. But for a British government, and probably for any British people who had any thoughts on it, the idea of Ireland being independent, it was like kind of saying Ipswich wants to be independent. Yeah. It just did not make sense to them. 800 years Ireland had been part of Britain. And even for a lot of people in Ireland, it didn't quite make sense that this could be a possible thing. So even in those terms, like, they found it hard to get their head around the fact that they are fighting a war.
They weren't about to let it go, really,
No,
were they? You know.
no.
You mentioned Vinnie Byrne there, and of course, a very young man. But also in that party, in the attack in the Upper Mount Street, I think it was Lieutenants Ames and Bennett. But it was Johnny McDonnell. Do you want to tell us who Johnny McDonnell was?
Well, Johnny McDonnell is an extraordinary character when you think of his place on Bloody Sunday. First and foremost, I suppose, he was a Dublin footballer, played in goal, a very well-known goalkeeper at the time. He was known as the man in the cap, for obvious reasons. We'd probably work him out, probably can be easily enough worked out. But he was also part of the O'Toole's Club, who had a very strong IRA presence, membership. Himself and his brother Paddy, who was another real star of the era, played midfield for Dublin. They would both have been involved in the Rising. They would have served time, came back, got back into playing Gaelic games again. And Johnny was part of this attack on Mount Street, which was put together at a very late stage. They knew that Ames and Bennett were there. They had only recently moved, I think, into those houses, so it was kind of a late job. But when they were looking for guys to put a squad together for this one, they went to the battalion that they knew the best and the guys they thought they could trust. And it had just happened that a lot of those guys were O'Toole's linked as well. So Johnny was one of the guys who went on the job
and of
that
course,
morning.
I suppose this kind of brings us to the point of how involved, is the GAA in the politics of that period.
Yeah, like it's an interesting one because I think you can spin it either way. Like if you look at the actual numbers of people who were GA members who were also volunteers, it's not that big, or who were actually active. It's not that huge. I mean, no more than now, the GA was a very broad church of people. Like, you had people who would have gone to Croke Park, for example, that afternoon, who would have been not interested at all in the politics of it. They were just going to see a match. You would have had people who would have seen the supporting of Gaelic games as very much part of their Irish identity and part of their politics and so on. And then you would have had people in the middle who were kind of going because they wanted to see the match, but a bit worried about, well, what might be about to happen, you know? So, I mean, in the same way as now, you go to a game and you'll come across people of all different persuasions, politically and otherwise. It was the same then.
Could you say that they were more nationalistic than Republican, or would that be just unfair to even try and categorise them?
I think it's just such a broad sweep of people. Look, on both sides, on the Dublin team and the Tipperary team, you had IRA volunteers.
But you had this strange story, really, didn't you, that Johnny McDonnell, the Dublin goalkeeper, is part of that squad operation that morning. And then in the afternoon, he's going to Croke Park to line out against Tipperary. Yeah,
it's an amazing sort of parallel that only emerged through the research with the book. I wasn't, before I started into it, I was not aware of this connection. But there he is, right front row centre.
You have a story, Michael, that Collins was actually on his way. Was he going to Croke Park when they run into a checkpoint, or was he actually just meeting up with the other guys?
Well, there was a guy, he was a prison warden in Portlaoise Jail, and he was sympathetic to the IRA cause, and he was bringing messages from the prisoners in Portlaoise Jail up to Dublin, and he was expecting to meet someone, not just an IRA person, and pass on the messages, and that'd be the height of it. But he's standing on Crossguns Bridge, which people who might know the geography of Croke Park. Crossguns Bridge, if you walk away from Croke Park up Whitworth Road towards Phibsborough, that bridge there is where this chap was. And the next thing, Michael Collins is there. It's the last person he expected to see. But he gives Collins the messages, and he's a bit sort of like, and the crowds are going to Croke Park, and Collins and this guy walk in the opposite direction back towards town. And the first thing they hit is a checkpoint, because straight away after the shootings that morning, the city goes into lockdown. Like, there's trams, buses, everything stops. Any traffic in and out of the city is stopped. So there's checkpoints all over the city trying to pick up anybody. So they come to the checkpoint, and the prison warden is terrified because he doesn't, well, whatever about Collins being caught, he certainly doesn't want to be the guy who's with Michael Collins when he's captured. So he kind of ruffles in his pocket, and he finds an old pass for Ship Street Army Barracks, and he kind of waves it at the Black and Tan or the soldier I think was at the checkpoint, and your man says, all right, go on ahead. So the two lads walk on down the street, they see an off-licence opening up across the way, they go in, your man knows the guy who owns the off-licence, and your man is so excited to have Michael Collins in the room. He's getting down, I think it's brandy, I think he gets down, and he's kind of running his hand along the top shelf, and he knocks a world of glasses and bottles and everything. The lads have their drink to settle their nerves and they walk on, but this is the knife edge that Collins and the IRA are walking at that time.
Yeah, and it's
really
the enigma of Collins, isn't it, really? You know, I mean, he's just this character. He becomes this myth on all sides, really. But I mean, you've just mentioned the lockdown. And of course, the barriers and that to come into place immediately because the agents have been assassinated. And it's not just 14 men were killed that morning, but there were other attacks as well. So there's a huge reaction. But now the military and the authorities focus on Croke Park. Why is that?
It's a great question. And I think the only answer really is that, and it goes back to your question about the links between GA and nationalism, that the GA at the time always wanted to be seen, no more than now, as a games-based organisation. We are concentrated on the playing of games. But there was no way you could not link them to nationalism. They were a 32-county operation. They were a group that, for example, when the volunteers got back together after the Rising, their first major meeting was in Croke Park. You know, Collins was a regular figure at Croke Park. Harry Boland, Owen O'Duffy, the leader in the north, met Michael Collins for the first time in Luke O'Toole's house. Luke O'Toole is the General Secretary of the GA. So privately, there was no doubt about where they stood. Publicly, they always, tried to project a different image, and they certainly never wanted to be seen as reacting to something, for example, like the shootings in the morning. So that they were ploughing their own furrow. I think from the British authorities' point of view, it was the one big massive event that was going on in Dublin that day. Okay. And the chances are that we'll shake a few trees, see what falls out. I mean, ostensibly it was a search operation. It didn't start out as a revenge mission or a reprisal. You say search, but they were looking for the men who had actually committed the murders that morning, rather than they weren't just searching for political, paraphernalia. They were taking a chance. Yeah, they were saying, right, we're going to go and we'll perform a search operation and see what we find. They gambled on the notion that there will be people here that would have been involved in the mornings, and they were correct. There was a nice few people actually went to Croke Park, despite being told by their superiors and by plenty of other people, don't go to Croke Park. Mm-hmm. A lot of the IRA men who were involved in the shooting that morning did go to Croke Park. Is it true that the IRA actually delivered a message to try and get them to postpone or cancel again? Three major IRA figures. Yeah, one of them was Sean Russell. Got word through some sources in the Dublin Metropolitan Police that something was planned. Okay, so that some kind of a force was coming to Croke Park. What the force would be, they didn't know. What form the action would take, they hadn't a clue. But they went to Croke Park, found Luke O'Toole, had a conversation with O'Toole, and just told him what they knew. They said, look, we don't know what it's going to be. Although Sean Russell did pass the remark, imagine if they opened up the machine guns, what a terrible thing that would be. But really, fundamentally, no one really thought that would happen. People were used to trucks of black and tans and auxiliaries kind of buzzing around the place, intimidating people. Luke O'Toole's big concern when he was given this information was, well, okay, the IRA guys are asking me to close to stop the game, evacuate the ground. His concern was, if I evacuate the ground, it could cause more of a panic. Yeah. I mean, how do you do that? How do you do it? I mean, we're talking about 15,000 people at a time when there was no matches really being played. This is a huge crowd for a game, for a challenge match. And Dublin and Tipperary were two prominent teams, but it was a very big crowd. So to get all those people out safely, O'Toole had to kind of balance up, well, where is the greater risk here? Give them their money back. I mean, there's that as well. Irate people. Angry people. And he's kind of thinking, well, what's likely to happen? Okay. What do we know what normally happens in this situation? So in the end, he kind of comes to a halfway house decision. He decides to close the turnstiles to try and limit the crowd that's going in. The IRA men head away in their separate directions, and the turnstiles close. But very soon, And you talk about irate customers. I mean, you get a glimpse of what could have happened even if they had stopped the game. And the crowds outside all of the turnstiles get so cross that one particular turnstile operator just kind of throws his hands up into the air and opens the gate again, and then all the turnstiles open. And maybe in that moment, the GA have a chance to, stop the game and avert what's coming next. But to be fair to them, you could never know what was coming next.
Nobody knew, because you could have had crowds of people jammed outside and jammed inside. I mean, nobody knew. With the benefit of hindsight, we know what happens. But maybe what does happen? I mean, is the military's intention to search people? But I mean, how do you search 15,000 people?
Yeah, from the theory. Okay, the theory from the British side that yes, there may be some people involved in the killings this morning in Croke Park. Now, yes, that does hold water, but that's where the logic ends. Like the idea of going to Croke Park, the idea of sending trucks down Jones's Road, lots of trucks, full of police, black and tans, auxiliaries, and to think that people are going to stand and be politely searched. It's ludicrous.
And you're talking hundreds of men, really.
You're talking over 100 auxiliaries and then another group of black and tans. And also then you have the military. The military were there as a kind of a cordon around the ground. Their job, as per the orders, was to make sure that the people coming out of the ground left in an orderly fashion. They didn't actually take part in any of the firing. As we'll probably come on to, an armoured car did fire, but they weren't firing at people. All the shooting was done by police.
Okay. And there is that other intangible element, that anger, the annoyance, the hatred, the brutality, whatever way we're going to look at this. I mean, there is a problem that day, really, isn't there? People are looking for revenge.
It's this conflict again between the order that's given and it's to be a search operation. But really, when those trucks are rattling across Dublin and heading to Croke Park and they park out in front of Croke Park, it's the men in those trucks control what's going to happen next. And a lot of the men in those trucks, when you think about it, they've been fighting an invisible war for a long time, some of them. Their enemy, the IRA, is invisible. A lot of these guys would have served in World War I. They were used to this, I suppose if you want to call it, formal warfare in trenches, and you were that guy over there, and I can see my enemy, or at least I know where my enemy is.
He's in a uniform, he's different colour, and I know where he is, yeah.
Now they're fighting this guerrilla war against guys who dress the same as everybody else, who are hiding in behind hedgerows, who are jumping out of behind walls.
Who have just assassinated 14 of their own, or more for all they know, but they've made a serious attack on them.
And so if you're in the trucks going to Croke Park, suddenly the Dublin and Tipperary teams become your visible enemy. They become an incarnation of the energy the enemy that you never see.
And do you think there's an understanding of, we talk about the legends of the republicanism of that time, like, the Dan Breens, the Sean Tracys and whatever. But is there an understanding that Tipperary, that men from outside of Dublin may have been involved in those attacks and are involved in the IRA? So this is kind of an obvious challenge to them, an obvious target for them.
Absolutely. And, it's funny, it might sound odd to say it, but it's actually a realisation that's really only come to me in the last couple of years, really, that, we'll say, the shootings occurred in Croke Park, the Dublin team left. Dublin team were left go. Mick Sammon, the referee from Kildare, left go. It's the Tipperary team that are put up against the railway wall when everything is over, in front of essentially a firing squad.
Yeah.
I think the sense at the time, and we go back to this idea of the IRA being a bit on the ropes, certainly in Dublin, activities had gone to such a low level that I don't think anyone in the British establishment, certainly in the British authorities in Ireland, thought that the Dublin branch of the IRA could have done this on their own, that there had to be a down-the-country element to this. And as you mentioned, Dan Breen is in Dublin at this stage. Sean Tracy had been shot the month before and killed on Talbot Street, So they were aware of these Tipperary guys. At one stage, during the War of Independence, Tipperary had the highest concentration of police officers of any county in Ireland. So that's a real hot spot for the War of Independence. And now we have this Tipperary team in Dublin. You've got angry auxiliaries in black and tans travelling across town, knowing they're going to this match. I mean, when you think about it, one of the black and tans, when the Tipperary team are lined up against the railway wall, one of the black and tans actually has a photograph of the team, and he's walking along, kind of rubbing it in their faces, going, "Look at this, you're not going to see these guys again." That's the gravity, and that's the extent to which they assign whatever happened in the morning, the blame, if you like, for whatever happened in the morning, and maybe for their entire experience in Ireland, to this team.
I mean, it's not the Michael Collins movie. It's not armoured cars driving onto the turf of Croke Park and opening up with machine guns. Who does what? You know, what happens at that moment when the black and tans and the auxiliaries turn up outside Croke Park? How does the firing start, or do we know what's the kind of the spark that sets it off?
Sure. And it's, you know, the Michael Collins reference is interesting. In fairness to Neil Jordan, at the time, he wouldn't have had the detail, I suppose, that's available to us now to see what exactly happened.
And he was making a movie.
Yeah. And I mean, the firing in Croke Park only lasted 90 seconds, but for Neil Jordan, he had to kind of capture, I suppose, the horror of a war of independence in about 20 seconds. So he did what he had to do, and that's, you know, it's fine. But the reality, to my mind, the reality of what actually happened is far more brutal and far more horrifying than anything that's ever been put up on screen. The trucks, as I mentioned before, the police trucks would have arrived at the Canal Bridge. Again, for people hopefully who will be aware of the geography of Croke Park, the Canal Bridge is on the Jones's Road side by what's now the Hogan stand. So they would have, the first truck would have crested the bridge, and then you would have had a line of trucks snaking all the way back up Russell Street, up towards Mountjoy Square. At that time in Croke Park, kind of in your head, I suppose, to get an idea of what Croke Park looked like, you just have to collapse all the stands that are there now. And if you're standing on the Canal Bridge now in 1920, you can look straight into Croke Park. You can see all the way up to Hill 16. You have a small laneway going down by the canal and a set of turnstiles. You have a canal wall running along the back. So that's what the black and tans were looking at when they landed on the bridge.
They could see right into
They could see all the way in.
There's a story about a plane. Should we just mention that?
Yeah. The game was 10 minutes old when the firing started. And just before the firing started, a plane flew over and set off a flare and then headed off towards the Phoenix Park. Now, the part of the story has always been that was a kind of like a signal for the black and tans to open up. Personally, I've never been convinced of that. I'm not sure what the plane was doing there. I'm not sure why it was firing off a flare. Winston Churchill was asked in the House of Commons subsequent to this, what was the plane doing? And he made the point that it was just on a routine manoeuvre over the city. The gun was dismantled. It had it wasn't part of the plan, if you like. We'll never know for sure whether it was or not.
Let's take it that the action begins then on the ground.
The action begins 10 minutes in. Instead of forming into lines when they jump out of the trucks, some of the black and tans take positions on the Canal Bridge. Some of them run down the laneway towards the turnstile and start climbing the turnstile. And the firing starts. The first shot rings out on its own. And just down by those turnstiles that I described, by the canal wall, there was a clump of trees. And there's an 11-year-old boy sitting in the tree. William Robinson is his name. He's come up from Little Britain Street in the middle of the city. And he's climbed a tree because he's 11 years old and he's got the best view in the house. But we know from the autopsy reports now that when he hears the noise, he turns to see what the noise is. And the first bullet goes through his chest and out his shoulder and knocks him from the tree.
But it's hard to believe that could have been random. I mean, surely somebody saw a figure in a tree or something. I mean, the chances of that first shot just hitting that boy.
It's callous. It's beyond reasoning. And I suppose the only way that it's the only way that it makes sense to us now is to say that it was a random shot. We never know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is symbolic of the brutality of what happens subsequent to this. I mean, William, at 11 years of age, getting shot from a tree, it's only the beginning.
Yeah.
The next shot, there's a 10-year-old boy, Jerome O'Leary, who's come up from the inner city as well. And he's actually just been lifted up onto the wall by another man to get a better view. He's sitting on the back of the canal wall, and the second shot hits him.
And this is the story of all of these, what we subsequently refer to as a tragic event. But all of these things, once the firing starts, it's extremely difficult to pull back on that. And it really all hell breaks loose, doesn't it?
It's beyond belief. So the firing starts in earnest, if you like, then. Like, there's just volleys of fire sweeping the ground. You've got black and tans climbing that set of turnstiles down at the corner of the canal and the Hogan, and just firing at knots of people running away. The crowd themselves are running, we'll say, and I'll put it in modern terms, if you like. So all the people who are on the Cusack stand side are running up towards the hill. All the people on the Hogan stand side are running up that direction as well. The people who are on the hill, and the hill at that time was really a flat piece of ground and then a bit of a mound in the corner, they just run out over the back of the corrugated fence and just flatten it. And they're jumping on trams, they're jumping on trams to get away. In the top right-hand corner is where we're looking at the junction of the Cusack and the hill. There's an exit. And people are just powering towards that exit. They're trampling over other people. They're trying to squeeze out the gap.
And this is the problem, isn't it? Once you start that stampede, I mean,
there's
people
no
are going down and are being trampled and crushed.
Yeah. So on the outside, you have an armoured car that I mentioned earlier, and the armoured car operator gets an order to fire some rounds in the air, or he hears an order to fire some rounds in the air. So he fires up in the air, but the result is that he actually pushes people back into the ground, into the crush that's already coming out.
Wow.
So at this point in the shooting, you have armoured cars shooting up in the sky, you've got people shooting from the other end, you've got this huge crush developing in that corner.
What are these guys shooting? Just to be, I mean, are they just, they're not Thompson submachine guns or Vickers machine guns?
Well, the Black and Tans would have had handguns and some of them had rifles.
Okay.
They're in the ground, some of them are shooting from the hip, some of them, as I say, are aiming at knots of people running away. And particularly men, they're aiming at knots of men running away, and it's just horrendous. I mean, it almost goes without saying that it's horrendous, but it's the kind of, for me, you know, when I started out doing the book, it was about the fact that there were so many gaps in the story, right? We didn't really know even the surnames of the people. We weren't sure exactly what happened, but as I got into it, I realised that there was a whole other, the real reason for doing this was to get to the story of the victims. And when you look around Croke Park as this horror is unfolding, it's just extraordinary what's going on.
But there's complete disregard for human life. They're out to inflict as many casualties as possible. I mean, shooting from the hip.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no, all the military training, everything's gone at
It's
this
gone.
stage.
I mean, it's so random. Excuse me. I mean, you have people afterwards who say, like, I got my heel shot off. One guy had his hat shot off. An RIC constable at the inquiries that are held after all of this is over pulls out like his notebook and his cigarette case that have been hit by a bullet. Like, his notebook is totally perforated and there's a bullet dent in the cigarette case, and his whistle is dented as well. I mean, it's just random, wild stuff.
I want to get to the victims, obviously,
Sure.
but just in terms of the story of it, how does the shooting stop? I mean, obviously, do they keep going until they run out of bullets, or is there what happens?
It lasts for 90 seconds. And effectively what stops it are the two commanding officers. The commanding officers for the Black and Tans was a guy, Major George Dudley, who was in the second truck. It's always amazed me that it took him so long to get down to the field to stop them, but he got down to the field and he was physically running around telling guys to stop firing. The head of the auxiliary force who was there was a Major Edward Mills. He was way back. He was in like the 13th or 14th truck in the convoy, so he had to run all the way up Russell Street, over the bridge, down into the turnstiles and stop the firing. So once they got a hold of it, then it stopped.
But that's crucial, isn't it, really? Because obviously their orders, their interpretation of that day was not to have this happen. I mean, their idea, they were to search. That was it.
It comes back to this conflict again between what's being ordered and the reality that the power in terms of what happens next really lies with those Black and Tans in the trucks.
Is it a fact that they couldn't control them, or is it a fact that these men were there first and they just started opening fire?
I think it's both. I mean, up to that point, you already had, I mean, look, we've all lived with the stories of the Black and Tans down the years. We know from our own life experience, listen to our relatives and stuff, how indisciplined that force was when they were in Ireland, how out of control they were. their superiors subsequently, when they wrote books and things, wrote the same thing, that they were just very, very difficult to control. The discipline was poor. So that in itself, straight away, they're a kind of a law unto themselves when they get to Croke Park. But you still look and you kind of go, well, the commanding officer can't be that far back. Okay. You know, it can't be that far back in the convoy. As I say, the black and tan commanding officer, Dudley, was in the second truck, but it took him that time to get down and actually stop them firing.
And it was too late.
It's a complete breakdown, and it's a complete breakdown in organisation, in authority, and that's the fundamental cause for what happens.
The real, I suppose, power of the book, and kudos to the GAA as well for the mini movies, the portrayals that are being developed at the moment, in terms of the looking at the victims, because really the power of this book is the ability to look at the lives of these people, to bring them to life once again, from obscurity, really. I mean, 14 people died that day in Croke Park, and yet you get this glimpse into their lives. I mean, Jane Boyle, I mean, maybe we'll go through all 14 very quickly. But I mean, we had Jane Boyle, a woman, and we had 3 young schoolboys. So maybe we can start with them, because that's really the horror that we don't expect on that day.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I mean, I think we all grew up in school and stuff like that, kind of saying, we know Bloody Sunday. People were killed in the morning, people were killed in the afternoon. But I think to really get to the core of the whole thing, it's the victims, it's the people who died. So Jane Boyle was 29 years of age. She was due to be married the following week. She went to the game with her fiancé, Daniel Byron, who was actually a tip man. And they're standing on what's now, it's actually still the halfway line on the Cusack stand side. If anyone is ever in Croke Park, if you're looking across the Cusack stand, there's a gate number 5 down at the front. Just look at the number 5, and just beside that spot is where Jane's body was found. When the firing started, they tried to make their way up to the exit that I mentioned at the corner of the Cusack and the hill. They were holding hands, and Daniel recalled afterwards that they were running up, and the crowd is like a wave just pushing them up. And the firing went on, and the next thing he just felt Jane's hand sag in his hand, and then she was gone. She was just swept away. He was swept one direction, she was swept the other direction. She'd been shot in the back, and then she was trampled. And I mean, you know, I mean, where do you go in terms of tragedy? I mean, she was buried in her wedding dress the following Thursday. When they got the body home, and this again tells you about how the victims' families were treated from the very beginning. They obviously asked how she died, and they were told initially she was trampled. But it wasn't until they got her home and they got her clothes that her brother held up her coat, just kind of lifted up her jacket like that, and whatever way it was window, it was shining, light was shining through the window, and they saw the hole, they saw the bullet hole of the coat.
You mentioned William Perry Robinson. He was up the tree. I mean, as you said, as 10-year-olds do, they climb into trees, and he was looking for free at this game. He was in his element, tragically, the first victim of it. But there were 2 other schoolboys, John William or Billy Scott and Jerome O'Leary. Do you want to just tell us a bit about those? Yeah,
Jerome was the youngest victim. He was 10 years of age, and he was sitting on the back of the canal wall. He was shot, killed instantly.
So perched up. I mean, again, as we do with kids, you put them in the best position you possibly can.
And you can imagine, again, it's a big crowd. Someone saw him probably stuck in behind a forest of legs. He wasn't going to be able to see anything, and they just did the nice thing and put him up on the wall. And he was shot. He was the second victim. John William Scott lived on Fitzroy Avenue, which is, and I mean literally, across the road from the Hogan stand. He would have walked down Fitzroy Avenue, taken a right, and gone down towards that little corner where William Robinson and Jerome O'Leary were. And he was hit by a ricocheted bullet, and the damage was so bad that the reports subsequent to that was that a boy had been bayoneted to death. There was questions again in the House of Commons about this boy who had apparently been bayoneted to death. But it was a ricochet. It was a ricochet bullet just blown his chest open, and he was carried away to a house on Clonliff Road. After the shooting stopped, a lot of spectators packed into houses all along,
just for their own safety.
Just for their own safety. And John William was taken into this one particular house and laid on the table, and the woman of the house and her daughter said prayers around him, and he asked for water. They couldn't get out to get him water because there was still, even after the actual firing, there was still pot shots going on outside, and it just wasn't safe. And he lasted 45 minutes, and he died. They put him outside. The soldiers came, the military came, took the body and put him on the pavement outside, didn't cover him. And Mrs. Coleman, who was the lady of the house, came out and covered him. But the most tragic thing for me with John William, I think that always catches me, is his father. When the firing had stopped, his father knew, obviously, his son had gone to the game, but he hadn't come home. So he went out.
He goes looking for him.
He goes looking for him, as a father would. And he's up and down the street looking for him. And somebody tells him that a boy had been taken to this house. So he goes to this lady's house, and John William's body has been taken away at this stage. And Mrs. Coleman tells John William Scott's father that, yeah, that was your son. But even in that moment, he's kind of going, are you sure? How can you be sure that this is my son? And she takes out his glasses and his tie pin and hands John William's glasses and tie pin to his father. And then his father knows. And it's almost...
Just that moment, an absolutely horrendous moment for any parent.
For any parent, I mean, again, it's unthinkable, it's unimaginable. You actually block yourself from actually even trying to feel what that man must have felt in that moment.
And of course, not everybody, again, something we didn't know, not everybody was shot. I mean, James Tehan, for example.
James Tehan, again, another Tipperary man, he owned a bar with his brother inside in the middle of the city, and he went to the game trying to get out that exit, was caught in the crush. James Burke, who worked for the Terranure Laundries and lived in the Dundrum area, Windy Arbour. Very same again. So I mean, you had this sort of, just this combination of just horrendous death.
But when you go down in that sea of people, or that, it's washing over you. I mean, there really is. We're a fragile entity, I mean.
Oh, it's just there's no nice way to die, but that is a truly
a couple of lovely stories as well. Patrick O'Dowd, I mean, in this moment of horror, and he's stopping to help other people.
Yeah, he was up on what would be the Cusack stand now. That time, that was just a bank with a 7-foot high wall across the top of it. And the drop the other side was 20 foot into the Belvedere Sports Grounds, which was there at the time. So Patrick, there was people just streaming over the wall, taking their chances, jumping down the 20 foot and just getting away. Patrick was 57 years of age. He was a labourer from Dublin. And, as one fella put it to me one time, on the day that everybody ran, Patrick O'Dowd didn't run. Mm-hmm. He stopped on the wall and he started pulling people up over. And we'll never know how many people he saved. But we do know that the last person he saved was a soldier. Oh. It was a guy who was presumably off duty or whatever, went to the game, and Patrick lifted him over and dropped him down the other side, probably like a bag of cement or something. And in that movement, Patrick gets shot as well, and he lands on that man. He lands on the last person he saved. And his body is found just outside the ground at the foot of the wall. It's, you have James Matthews, who was trying to climb the wall further up, but he got shot in the leg and slipped back down into the ground again and was died of his wounds.
And yet you don't think shot in the leg. You think that that's something you could recover from.
Yeah.
But of course.
But again, the crowd that's coming over, Michael Foley, and again, we talk about the mix of people that would have been in Bloody Sunday, and I think sometimes
Michael Foley, I mean, he was an ex-British soldier. 2
tours of duty in World War I. He was at the game wearing his British Army fatigues.
Again, not a story we heard before.
No, I suppose, we've been reared on the story of the War of Independence and stuff as a black and white story. These are not. Life isn't black and white. It doesn't matter when and where it happens. Like Michael Foley lived on Gardner Place in real poverty, came down. He didn't have clothes. His best clothes on a November day were his army fatigues that he would have worn in the war, and that's what he was wearing in Croke Park. Climbs over, gets an awful thigh wound. He dies. He bleeds out on the canal bridge itself. He's taken into someone's house, and he stays. His body is left unclaimed in the morgue for 4 days.
Which is really tragic, isn't it? I mean, it's like that he wasn't missed almost.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I mean, and again, his one kind of something to look forward to in life was probably that football match. I mean, you're there. Remembering you're there just to see a football match. That's what it was. It wasn't about the politics.
This is the thing that I think how would you put it? It's the thing that amplifies the horror, in the sense that, and I suppose I say that knowing that if this had happened anywhere, it would have been horrifying. But Croke Park, for all of us, and I mean, it doesn't matter whether you never went to a Gaelic football or hurling match in your life, and you only ever went to Croke Park to see a gig, or you went for some event, you would have gone to Croke Park probably looking forward to what you're going to. You're going there with a free mind. This is your place of play. This is your place of joy. This is the place that you go to get away from the humdrum. And it would have been the same for the people in 1920. And that's what really links. I mean, sometimes it's hard to kind of link 100 years apart, but that's what links it intrinsically, is that the very same people who go to matches now went to matches in 1920.
And yet, I suppose when we look at it as well, maybe only one name ever really stuck out, and that was Mick Hogan.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't it tragic that we knew people died, but yet it was Mick Hogan because the Hogan stand.
Yeah, and like Mick was a cornerback for Tipperary, and even within that, and it's kind of reflective of a lot of the Bloody Sunday story, that up the years things got slightly distorted and maybe amplified here and there for effect almost. You know, I mean, you would have often heard that the Tip Dublin game was an All-Ireland final. It wasn't an All-Ireland final, it was a challenge game. That Michael Hogan was the captain of the Tip team. He wasn't. He was a second-year cornerback hanging in there, marking one of the best players in the Dublin team, Frank Burke, and trying to get someone else to swap with him all the way up to the
You
throw-in.
bring that out brilliantly. It's that fear, a really rational fear that he has, the nervousness before the game. What all he's worrying about is actually playing that game of football and having to mark Frank Burke.
Exactly.
But of course, the tragedy is that he doesn't make it off the field.
He doesn't make it off the field, and he's the one player who didn't make it off the field, I suppose, which is a poignant thing when you think about it. He's the one player who's played in Croke Park who never made it off the field.
And that other story then, Tom Ryan.
Yeah, Tom Ryan from Wexford. So Michael Hogan had been crawling up towards the hill end, and the idea being that he was going to try and get to the edge of the pitch and then jump in with the crowd and disappear, but he doesn't make it that far. He gets shot and killed as he's crawling. And in that instant, just as he's getting shot, Tom Ryan sees Hogan falling. Tom Ryan, another IRA volunteer, was actually involved in a planned attack that morning that didn't come off, comes across and whispers an act of contrition in Michael Hogan's ear, but he's shot while he's crouched over Hogan.
Trying to do a human
thing. Yeah, and he crawls out of Croke Park and he's taken to hospital. He dies that night. So yeah, it's the humanity of what's going on. So you have Patrick O'Dowd pulling people to their safety at one end of the ground. You have a guy whispering in the ear of a dying player at the other end of the ground. It's the terrible humanity of it all.
And as you say, like, I mean, not everybody died instantly either. I mean, we had young Tom Hogan, only 19.
Tom Hogan was 19 years of age from Limerick. He'd only just come up to Dublin that summer. Went to the game and got shot in the shoulder. He got to hospital, they amputated the shoulder, but he lasted for 5 days. He was the last Bloody Sunday victim to die the following Friday, taken home to a huge funeral. But yeah, again, the age, 19. Like, I mean, you look at that's another thing that's always struck me, you know, if people are trying to make sense of this story in their head, you just have to think, well, what were you doing at 19, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, the first time I was ever in Croke Park at a match, I was 10 years of age, same age as Jerome O'Leary was. And all you have to do is think, well, how would Jerome O'Leary have been feeling going to that match? The exact same way I did going to my first match in Croke Park.
And that excitement, that adrenaline, that rush, and just pure excitement, never expecting something like this. No. Daniel Carroll, of course, he made it out as well, but...
Yeah, Dan Carroll, a Temple Dairy man from Tipperary, he was working in a bar in Drumcondra. He was, as you say, he was out, he was gone. He was walking up Russell Street and a stray shot from a truck hit him in the leg, and he was taken to hospital. And, you know, we've been able to meet some of the families since, and the sense you get of all of you get more of a sense of their personalities. And Daniel Carroll, again, the stories of Daniel Carroll come up, he would have been a lovely man. And he actually survived long enough for his employer to visit him the following day. And he had been humming and hawing whether he'd go to the match. He wasn't sure would he go down, but he decided he would in the end because he was a tip man and he loved going to the matches in Croke Park. But he says to his employer, like when your man's at the bedside chatting to him, he said, wasn't it misfortunate that I went? Yeah. I go, and just in that moment, a person's entire life is defined and decided.
But of course, nobody, could
No.
anticipate this.
Not at all.
And Joseph Traynor, the last of the victims,
Yeah.
a young footballer, an IRA volunteer.
Yeah, 19 years of age, or 20 years of age, 20 years of age. Cycled in from Ballymount with his friends. His house was more, he worked in a lime kiln, in a quarry that was more or less where the Red Cow craziness is now. It was pretty much there. So he would have cycled over to Croke Park, as you say. He was a footballer, he was an IRA volunteer, and he was shot. He was trying to climb over the canal wall that I mentioned before where Jerome O'Leary was sitting. He was trying to climb over it and he got hit and he slumped over the side. And neighbours, people from Sackville Gardens, which is just further up the canal, when the firing stopped, people came out of the houses. I mean, again, we talk about the humanity of all this. They came out of the houses and came down the canal looking to see could they help people. Yeah. And the Ring family, a couple of brothers, picked up Joseph Traynor and brought them back to their house and got an ambulance, and he died in the ambulance on the way to hospital then.
There were IRA men at the game, as you've mentioned a couple of times. At the end of the shooting, when it's finally brought under control, and I think we have to give Major Mills, which is a story we would never have heard about, an auxiliary officer actually possibly saving lives on that day, because we tarnish them with the same brush we do with the black and tans.
Yeah.
But how does it all come to an end then? The searches, were these IRA men apprehended? What happens when the firing stops?
When the firing stops, the search operation begins. So the crowd that are there are organised into lines and the search begins. They're looking around for anything. They're looking at notebooks to see is there any incriminating documents, anything at all, names, anything they might recognise, guns, obviously they're looking for revolvers. But they find nothing. They find one revolver thrown into the back of a garden. That's what they find in Croke Park that day. Now, the official reports that start coming out that night, one of them says they found 30 revolvers thrown around Croke Park. They did not.
And no guns actually in Croke Park. That was in a garden outside.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Probably one of the IRA men running away, trying it away. As I said, there was guys from the squad that morning, but they all got away. They all escaped. So, again, what starts to happen almost immediately is this kind of retelling of the story, this reshaping of the story to suit the narrative that the British authorities need to get out there, that this wasn't a wanton massacre of citizens. This was something else. This was something that they were reacting to. And that happens almost straight away. The first reports say that the first firing comes from outside the ground. So when the trucks arrive up, and again, this was a natural reaction in Ireland at the time. If you saw a police truck, you ran away. So that's what happened outside the ground. Ticket sellers and people selling oranges and apples and things, they all ran away. The first official report said that those people who were running away were firing shots. The second report nuanced that.
So they fired at us.
Yeah.
We were only defending ourselves.
We retaliated.
It's the standard myth, isn't it? Really?
Exactly. And then the second statement, see, they're releasing statements as the night goes on into Sunday night. The second statement then is refined slightly to say that the firing comes from inside the ground first. And this is the narrative based fundamentally, without wanting to labour all the points, this is fundamentally the narrative that the British government and the British authorities stick to, that the firing comes from inside the ground first, the police are reacting, and yes, the firing ultimately is in excess, they say in the inquiry reports that happen, in excess of what was necessary, but they were provoked.
But there was a further commission, wasn't there? The Labour Party, was it the Irish Labour Party?
It was the British Labour Party.
British Labour Party actually had come to Ireland to kind of look at terror in general, but they interview and they meet up with victims.
Exactly. So the two inquiries that I'm referring there to were inquiries that happened in camera. So essentially, no public gallery, no reporting, and even the reports themselves, it's up to the government what they do with the reports that they're
and did they pick who they asked the questions of as well?
They went in, and I mean there is a good span of witnesses. I mean there's black and tans, Luke O'Toole from GA's there are eyewitnesses, various different people. So you have the two inquiries are in the Jervis and the Mater hospitals. They're picked because they're the places that the dead and the wounded were taken. So those are ongoing. And as you say, then you have this British Labour Party Commission, which is travelling around Ireland, trying to get a sense of, well, what's going on? Can we manage this terror better? It's interesting, when you look at the media at that time in England, you do see this very definite split between left and right. So the establishment newspapers, if you like, the Times of London, the Telegraph and so on, are following the government line. But then you have this other group. A lot of them have correspondents embedded in Ireland, and they're reporting a very different sort of war. So these Labour Party politicians are going around to places like Balbriggan, for example, which had been sacked in September 1920, basically burned to the ground. And they're going and they're talking to the people in Balbriggan and various different people trying to get that story. So they come to Croke Park, and they interview a lot of the people who have given testimony to the inquiries, but also they talk to people, for example, like Daniel Byron, Jane Boyle's fiancé, who wouldn't testify at the inquiries because they were in camera, but he will talk to the Labour Party guys. Mm-hmm. So you get their version of events there. And what you find is the official inquiry version, and this is Black and Tans testifying and so on, the official version there is, oh, we were fired on first, right? What you find with this other group of interviews is that people are saying, no, the first firing came from outside the ground. And there's enough, without wanting to get into the minutiae of it, but there's enough in the testimony that's given at the official inquiries to say there are things contradicting each other here. There are people who are saying that the firing came from inside the ground first, are contradicting themselves on other details that would suggest that their stories aren't absolutely 100%. And when I say contradicting themselves on details, I mean they're saying that, well, this group of police went in this entrance when it wouldn't have been possible for them to go in that entrance, and then another group of police will say, well, no, they weren't firing.
So they can recognise it as being contrived.
Yeah.
You picked a marvellous line from the Labour Party Commission, which was a comment on the spirit of calculated brutality and lack of self-control.
Yeah.
And really, this is it. This is the comment where it just fell apart, and these guys just opened up. You know, they don't buy into this, you know, defending themselves idea at all.
No. Not at all. And I think that line probably goes to the heart of the issue with policing in Ireland and the issue of policing Ireland at the time. Ultimately, you had a group of policemen who, number one, weren't trained for the guerrilla warfare they were facing. Number two, who had some of them come from extremely traumatic experiences in the war. And I'm not for a second making excuses for them, but it's just the context of what they're coming from. Essentially what I'm saying is they are not prepared for what they're being landed into.
And there were, at least we like to think in one way, that there was very little control over them. They were a force of nature unto themselves.
Well, you had situations as the War of Independence unfold where they're being told by their superior officers, go on ahead. You're being provoked, go on ahead. There is a sort of an official line where they're being discouraged, but then there's this other kind of practical effect where they're being, I wouldn't say encouraged, but they're certainly not being discouraged.
What happens in the aftermath? I mean, Dublin must have been, you know, I mean, the funerals must have went on for a week or more. I mean, does the city really, you know, mourn this loss, this tragedy? Or is it just a scared and horrible place that people are locking the doors and afraid to even go out to these funerals?
Well, like, if you think about even the Sunday night, 3 more people are killed in Dublin Castle.
And that's Conor Clune, you mentioned?
Yeah, Paddy Clancy and Dick McKee, 2 IRA men, and Conor Clune had no connection whatsoever with any movement.
Wrong place at the wrong time, it seems, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then even on top of that, so you have...
And so that's, these were shot while trying to escape, which is, again, another...
Yeah, it's been pretty well disproven that it was, you know, again, the official line, as you say, was that they were shot trying to escape, and they even contrived some photographs to show what had happened and so on. They were tortured and killed. You also then had, you know, an elderly man and another child were killed when Black and Tans were doing a search somewhere up around Capel Street. And the crowds, again, were out looking and seeing what's going on, and to try and calm the crowds, they just fired, and two more people were killed. So it was this kind of constant sort of terror on the streets.
Do we know how many people were actually wounded at the game as well?
Well, it
must have been
hundreds, I'd say, hundreds. And I mean, people ask me that a lot, and I can't put a figure on it because I don't think it's fair to put a figure on it. It's impossible to know. I mean, the reports the following day are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. But I mean, you can imagine, again, I mean, I've come across people since who will come to me and say, well, this particular chap passed away 6 months after Bloody Sunday as a result of the wounds he would have picked up, or the physical damage that was done to him in the crush or something like that. So you have a lot of these kind of legacy wounds or injuries.
But it really is true. I mean, it's a stupid thing to say in one respect, but it could have been tremendously worse. It could have been so much worse. I mean, if there had been a machine gun on that field, I mean, if the firing had not been stopped by these officers after 90 seconds, I mean, it just, must have been absolutely hellish.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, before we forget them, the Tipperary team, who were, I think I mentioned it earlier on, while the Dublin team were let go and the referee was let go, the Tip team were corralled up against the old railway wall, which is still there, still behind the Nally end and the hill. But they were there, and there was a line of Black and Tans and auxiliaries ready to take them out, and it's Major Mills who comes in between the two lines, walks along the line, and essentially escorts the players back to the dressing room to safety, and then they go their separate ways. So I mean, it could have been. I mean, it's an unimaginable tragedy as it is. As you say, God only knows how much worse it could have been. But just to go back to your point about the funerals, because I think it's a key example of how the grief was suppressed, if you like to put it that way. On the one hand, you have the spies and the agents. They're carried on gun carriages along the quays. People are allowed to gather along the quays. They're expected to gather along the quays. And in fact, if they haven't taken their caps off, there are police walking through the crowd and they're pulling caps off and throwing them into the Liffey. So you are being obliged to show respect to these people. The Bloody Sunday victims are told, their families are told, no shows of strength, no flags, only close family.
This is like 1916 again, wasn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Keep it small and keep it quiet. Now, in that 14, excuse me, you actually have 4 IRA volunteers. Now, when we say IRA volunteers, that doesn't mean that they're out on the ramparts firing. Like, an IRA volunteer could be a guy carrying a hurley on his shoulder and turning up to the volunteers just as a thing to do. We don't know. I personally don't know the degree of Tom Hogan's involvement, Joseph Trainor's involvement. Michael Hogan was active, but his brother Dan would have been the real active one in that family, or Tom Ryan for that matter. I know Tom Ryan was quite active. But their funerals, we say Tom Hogan's funeral in Brewery, there's a show of strength. At Michael Hogan's funeral, the volunteers stand guard over his coffin that night. But for a lot of these victims, they're buried quietly, out of the way. One of them is buried in a cemetery that's not even his local graveyard. And a lot of them don't put headstones up because they either don't have the money to do it, but more often they don't want to draw attention to the fact that they have a relative who's been killed in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday for fear of further reprisal from the police. One family wanted to wait until all the chaos had calmed down so they could put up the gravestone they wanted. But then time moves on, but that
brilliantly brings us to the graves project, the headstone project. I mean, we're skipping it forward 100 years. One of the things we mentioned as you were setting up is that they had a commemorative match every year up till the 70s. I mean, that was complete news to me. I was delighted to think that Mick Sammon, a Kildare man, who refereed the Bloody Sunday match, was brought back in 21 to referee as well.
They had the exact same game again.
Yeah, and I won't let you go without talking about the Kildare connection. We have to clear the air about Frank Burke's Dublin years, but he certainly was a good Kildare man. But in terms of the families, one of the beauty of the new edition of the book, I noticed that you changed the beginning, and you started with this lady, Nancy Dillon, or Nancy Mattis, which you mentioned, Johnny, the pronunciation of Matthews. But Nancy had never been to her father's grave. No. And again, it brings it back to that point that these were low-key. He was buried in an unmarked grave.
James Matthews was buried in an unmarked grave in Glasnevin, that's right. And his wife at the time, they had 2 daughters, and his wife was pregnant, 6 months pregnant with their third daughter when James was killed. And their third daughter was Nancy, who was born the following spring. And she never met her father. And her idea of her father was sort of only formed as she got older. For a while, she didn't think her mother was ever married. She wasn't sure the circumstance of his death. She eventually obviously found out that he was killed in Croke Park. But there was never any talk of a gravestone. Her mother struggled in the sense of the grief. Again, we talk about the legacy of Bloody Sunday. I mean, these things happen, and we read them in the page of a book, or we read them whatever, or see them in a line on a television program, and we say, well, that's the end of that. It's like throwing a stone in a pond. The ripples go up through the generations. So James Matthews' wife is struggling, living in the tenements with two young daughters and a baby. She has her struggles all of her life, and those struggles are reflected a little bit in the family all the way up. But Nancy, it's the original book came out in 2014, and at that stage I'd kind of made contact with a few families, but not many. But thanks be to God, since we've been able to make contact with 12 out of the 14 families. Two family lines have died out. Wow. and one of them was Nancy. She was still alive in 2016. We went down, myself and the film crew, and we interviewed Nancy, and we met the family, and it was just.
She would have been 96 at this stage.
She would have been 90. Yeah, your sums are better than mine now, Mario. He should have whatever. Yeah, 1921 to 2016, 95, I suppose 96.
And
yeah,
just to be there.
And to be there, and later that year, then that summer, August. So we met her in July, and then in August, as part of the Bloody Sunday Graves project, which basically is the GA getting in touch with the families, and if the family wants to put up a gravestone, the GA will help them out to do that. So that's the basic premise of it. The whole, I suppose, we can come back to the GA impact if you like, but I suppose for the GA, it's a way of, it's a form of duty of care, I think, from the GA's point of view to the victims now. It's what they can do now 100 years later. So that gravestone went up, and Nancy was there to see her father's gravestone go up with a little picture of him in it. And,
well, it's tremendous respect to the organisation for that, really, isn't it? I mean, because this is something to actually step up. 7 people have actually had gravestones erected because of this.
Yeah.
Most notably, I think you had 3 last year as well.
That's right. We did 3 in one day. We did Jerome O'Leary, who had no family left. But, you know, as we keep saying, you know, he's part of a Bloody Sunday family. You know, there was as big a crowd around his grave as there were for any of them. So we Jerome O'Leary, Michael Foley, and Patrick O'Dowd were the 3 that we did last November.
Well, look, your personal journey then. I mean, did you start out with this? Was it something that just intrigued you? You knew the story of Bloody Sunday. You're obviously part of your interest, your job, your work is sports and GAA and so on. But I mean, where has this brought you? I mean, is it something beyond what you would have ever expected? Was it just a book that you expected to finish and move on that's developed into something else? Or?
It's gone its own direction, all right. Like, I mean, I suppose my interest in it was kind of peaked really whenever Ireland played England in 2007. In that Six Nations game at Croke Park, and there was a lot around that at the time of the whole idea of England coming to play in Croke Park, and God Save the Queen being played. And Bloody Sunday obviously was brought in directly into it. But what I noticed when you looked through the reports at the time, it was no one's fault, but there was an awful lot of contradictions and sort of stuff that weren't right, you know. Someone was wrong somewhere anyway, and so that kind of stuck in my head. It was in my head for a few years, but I didn't kind of think. I'm interested in history, but I didn't study history at school, at college, I mean, and I just kind of, I suppose I was a bit intimidated by the idea of it, but I did feel that there was a story there to be told. So eventually 2011 started into it, 3 years of research, and out comes the book. In terms of the impact, it started exactly as you described it. This is, obviously it's something that I felt it needed to be done, but I didn't know where it was going to take me. And very quickly I realised, I remember being in the newspaper library in London and scrolling through microfilm of old tabloid newspapers actually from the time, and suddenly I came across 2 pictures, one picture of Jane Boyle and one picture of Jerome O'Leary, and it just kind of just sat me back, you know. I kind of went, my God, that's them, because I'd never seen a picture of Jerome O'Leary before, certainly, and kind of this little 10-year-old boy looking back at you. And then you go to Kew Museum and they have this little cardboard box, and you open up the cardboard box and inside is the original order to go to Croke Park and the original Croke Park map. And there's letters, a couple of letters that would have been sent by some families to the British authorities looking for a little help for the son of a victim, and the reply. And so it's little small little things. When I saw those, and suddenly it dawned on me through the process that the story here isn't filling in the gaps. The story here is actually reclaiming these victims' lives and realising, again through the research, that 8 of them were in unmarked graves. And kind of, I remember by the time I got to the end of it, all I wanted when I got to the end of it, and like I remember at the time, we didn't do a launch, the publishers organised publicity and stuff, but I wasn't mad up for big massive publicity around it. I just wanted to go out and let it be done, and that's it. You know, I talked to whoever wanted to talk to me, but I wasn't going to go actively looking for publicity, do you know what I mean? But the one thing I wanted was the graves. I was kind of going, how can we do this now? How can we get the graves to happen? And what actually happened was, it was the Boyle family took it up themselves. And I got an email from one of their relatives, and we got talking, and then the GA kind of were notified. I helped to notify the GA, and the president of the GA turned up, and we managed to. I remember they made a commitment in Glasnevin that day that they'd look into setting up a proper project for the rest of them. And I remember chasing. It was Egon O'Farrell was the GA president at the time. I remember chasing him out the gate at Glasnevin and going, can I just double check? Are you going to look into this? Are you definitely going to? And he was kind of like, yes, we are going to look into it, you know. And I came away going, yes, okay. That's all I ever wanted, was that for at least the opportunity for the families, because I'm aware that even, and again it might sound odd, 100 years later, there is still trauma and grief involved in all of this, and it might not be for the victims directly, but maybe for people that the families would have known, like maybe a sister of the victim, or someone who was their aunt who knew the victim and talked about them a lot. There's a lot to unpack in this for the families. But where it's gone since, in terms of everything that's organised this year, it's kind of, you know what it's like? It's a bit like driving a car in ice, and you just, at one point when you're on the ice, you just would take your hands off the wheel and say, look, this is just going to go wherever it's going to go.
But I mean, you are coming to an end. I mean, you've erected 7 graves. You mentioned 8 unmarked graves. Is that one other grave to be done as well?
It's in the ether. It's kind of with the family. Again, all we do is we just let the family know that we're here if they want help and support in whatever way we can offer it. And if they don't want it, that's fine too. Yeah, so it's there.
But here we are 100 years on, and you have risen these victims from the dust. And
well, I don't know, I mean, the families would have always looked after those stories. I think the families were always there. And
but it's not something they talk about either sometimes.
Well, sometimes, but in the case for a lot of the families, they would have tried to reach out to the GA, but it wouldn't have gotten anywhere. And I think what I found, again, when you look at the GA and the families, what I noticed was there would have been a lot of alienation and frustration from the family side of things, that they would have felt up the decades that they were kind of ignored. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them would have felt they were ignored. And I think from the GA side of things, I genuinely think that the GA weren't really in a space or in a position to even process. Like I personally think the GA are now, through the Bloody Sunday Graves project and through everything, processing the trauma of Bloody Sunday now. At the time, they didn't refer to it in any official reports. There's nothing. They just kind of pushed it away. But I think the way the organisation has evolved into a more, it was always a community-based organisation, but it really is now. I mean, we all see it in our towns and our villages and cities. How did you operate within games, beyond games as well?
But this whole decade of centenaries probably in some way helped as well.
Absolutely.
Because it focuses us all on the fact that there is a history there.
Yeah.
Not always a history we want to explore, but it's a history.
And it's okay to explore, and it's okay to have contradictions, and it's okay to kind of look back and go, we should have done this and we should have done that. That's fine. But let's do something now. And I mean, the GA, to their credit, have been, what I've really admired about what they've done is that they have put the victims and the families front row centre, even in all the commemorative events that are kind of planned and are ongoing now. The whole point of the whole thing is look at these 14, look at them, look at their stories, and you will learn through their stories about what happened that day.
You mentioned a box in Kew, and finding those little historic paraphernalia, the ephemera that kind of survives. And in the GAA Museum, of course, the referee's whistle, which brings us back to my Kildare connections. I can't let that go.
No.
But Mick Sammon, he'd won in All-Ireland in 1919.
It's like the equivalent. Referee. It's like the equivalent of imagine. I think of it now of like, imagine Brian Fenton managing next year's All-Ireland. You know, it's like that. Like he had been midfield for Kildare in 1919 when they won the All-Ireland, and now he was here the following year refereeing away. It seems to have been a common thing. Like Mick Hogan's brother Dan was a very good footballer. He actually played for Monaghan. He would have refereed also championship games as well as playing for Monaghan. Yeah. So it was a thing. But Mick Sammon was part of that great Kildare team. And
we know he had a little bit of a Republican activity as well. He was arrested for reading a Sinn Féin manifesto outside Mass in, I think, 1918, and he spent a month in prison or something. But I mean, again, as you said, a lot of these guys were involved, but their football and their sport was something separate as well. And I think it was just part of who they were. But Frank Burke, I mean, if I hear one more about this great Dublin footballer, Frank Burke was born in Carberry in County Kildare. Right. But he really was a phenomenon.
He's an extraordinary player. Like, I mean, and again, you know, when you're looking at these games from distance, and obviously football then is completely unrecognisable to football now, but we can still draw parallels between great players and what you see in the reports that tell you they're great players. And Frank Burke was a great, great player. Dual All-Ireland medalist for Dublin, but as a footballer, seeing as we're talking about football really today, I suppose, the way I describe him is it seems like he was like a Colm Cooper type, but stronger, physically more imposing again. On the day of that game, as we mentioned before, Michael Hogan didn't want to mark him because, again, rookie cornerback going out against Frank Burke, you know, I'll give that to somebody else who's been down this track before, you know, but no one would swap with him. So he ended up, having to look at the situation of marking an absolute legend, you know. But I mean, Frank's story is extraordinary.
There's a story you have which we must tell, because I mean, Mick Hogan is marking him, but he wanted a swap. But was it Bill Ryan?
That's right.
And he ties up Bill Ryan. He uses the shoelace.
That's right. Bill Ryan, when they were coming up the day before, the Tipperary team, they got into a bit of a scuffle with a bunch of British soldiers. And in the middle of the scuffle, poor Bill Ryan now, who would have been on the team a good few years at this stage, Bill Ryan's boots are thrown out the window of the train. So he gets to Dublin, no boots, so he's got a replacement pair. So by the following day, the boots are too big for him. And they're kind of sore, and they're just, it's not a good scene. So, and Mick Hogan now is in his ear asking him, will you swap? Because, you've been on the team ages, you'd be well able for Frank Burke. And Bill is saying, I can't, the boots are destroyed. So in the heel of the hunt, when Mick Hogan, gets knocked back in the dressing room before they're going out, I mean, it's
just not going to happen.
It's just not going to happen. Mick goes back to his kit bag and he pulls out a brown lace, that he's a spare lace, and he gives it to Bill to tighten up his boots, and Bill kept the lace for the rest of his life.
Wow. And that's how, again, he dealt with that day. I mean, he could not part with that lace.
No, and they won, Tip won the All-Ireland subsequent to that. The 1920 All-Ireland was 2 years later, and he tied his medal onto the lace, and he had a Munster medal on the lace. And
just pure respect.
Yeah.
But I mean, Frank Burke, that great Kildare man I'd mention again, but he was a force of nature off the field as well, wasn't he?
He was one of these guys that kind of, encapsulates so much of what was going on, but again, it's in kind of like full-blown technicolor. You know what I mean? I mean, a lot of GA players would have been members of their local volunteer group, and they would have marched and they would have done all the things, but they wouldn't necessarily have been involved in activities. Frank Burke, different story. Like Frank, as you say, from Carberry, went to school in Rathfarnham. Patrick Pearce was his headmaster, and a real hero. He was Frank's hero for the rest of his life. So by the time 1916 comes around, Frank is in school, boarding in St. Enda's above there. He's old enough to be involved. So on their holidays, if you like, he's there making little bombs and sorting out cartridges and filling cartridges with gunpowder and stuff like that. And he's part of a battalion called Pearce's Own, because he was actually presented with his rifle by Pierce. So he's absolutely wedded into this. So Easter Rising comes, and of course you have all the confusion with countermanding orders and who's meant to be where and what. But Frank goes into the city centre anyway on Easter Monday and manages to make his way across to the GPO. And the first thing he's told to do is go up to the roof, and he's up on the roof beside the tricolour, and he spends another part of the week downstairs and in the front window on the front of the GPO looking out, and his sister was there, and I mean that was his experience, you know. He's involved in the last stand. I mean again, you talk about, you know, moments. I think Mark Twain had a line about, you know, things that swing the hinges of history, you know. Frank was part of the final group that were at the top of Moore Street, ready to kind of run down the barrel of the guns at the other end when word came through that, lads, there's been a truce. I mean, Frank Burke at that stage was a very, very young kid. He was about to die.
He was imprisoned in Frongok?
Was then taken to Frongok subsequently. And there's a lovely image, it's always stuck with me. He was let go at Christmas, and he came back to Carberry, he came home, and they describe his journey home through the countryside of Kildare, and the only lights are the little the Christmas candles in the windows as he's going along until he gets to his own home house, and then he's home in Carberry. But he goes back to Dublin, and sure, what else are you going to do? Only go off and win an All-Ireland hurling medal with Dublin next.
And he takes over St Enda's.
And he takes over St Enda's then subsequently. I mean, an extraordinary man.
Yeah. Wins All-Ireland football and hurling medals.
And hurling medals, yeah. I mean, just a brilliant talent, and like, you know, I mean, as you say, a dub. Certainly, he wore the dub jersey, but I'm sure he wore his Kildareness underneath the jersey always. You know.
Well, actually, when they played the Kildare won the 1919 All Ireland, but there was a challenge match later that year. I think it was for Prisoners' Dependence Fund or something. I'm not too sure, but actually, Burke played Dublin and Kildare, and Burke togged out with Kildare. You know, again, one of these things that the players, when you bring it down to that level, that these guys did themselves. Yeah. But look, Michael, absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for bringing these stories to life. And I mean, I did actually read through it, and I was just lost in the detail of their lives. And I got very moved with those little miniature movies, I have to say as well, because I think, again, as you say, the GAA doing us all proud by putting the victims and the families to the fore. Thank you to Michael Foley, to Riverbank Arts Centre, to Junefest, to the Decade of Commemorations Committee, and to the Locust Studies Genealogy and Archives Department of Kildare County Library, and of course Kildare County Council, and the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. Manma agus Mishnach, spirit and courage, the motto of Kildare. May we continue to possess both. Thank you.